So, my talk is called Transgenderism and Male Violence, which the use of that "and" there I think is rather misleading because it suggests that I think that these are two different things. Following what we've heard so far today in the conference, I think probably a lot of us are coming to the conclusion that transgenderism is in itself very much a form of male violence. So I would like to clarify any possible sort of misleading elements of that title. I think transgenderism is definitely a form of male violence. We know, as Sheila's talk very emphatically pointed out, we know that historically transgenderism is a thoroughly male-dominated movement, supported, facilitated and promoted by male-dominated institutions. And I think first and foremost, and I'm really picking up on I think some of Leah's content, not to mention Jackie's very colourful content there. First and foremost, I think the violence of transgenderism is the violence of the male self, as that self seeks to assert and expand its presence and meaning through the violation of women's boundaries. So I think we need to think about violence in the sense of that, of meaning violation. And I thought these words from Andrea Dworkin, and we know there's a certain attempt now to kind of rescue some of Andrea Dworkin's work and sort of deploy it to the ends of the trans lobby. I think that any sort of close reading of Dworkin, or not doesn't even have to be that close, any reading of Dworkin, I think it testifies very much to the opposite of that. And so I would like to begin just by giving you this quotation and thinking about transgenderism through her words here. And she's talking here about the male power of self. The male power of self. I think she expresses it beautifully. I've had to edit a little bit because it was a bit long. So she says, the power of men is first a metaphysical assertion of self, an I am that exists a priori, indifferent to denial or challenge. It expresses intrinsic authority. Oh, if I cut that bit, I've cut that bit out there. The first tenet of male supremacist ideology is that men have this self, and that women must, by definition, lack it. The absolute self is expressed in the absolute right to take what it needs to sustain itself. Self is incrementally expanded as the parasite drains self from those not entitled to it. To him it is given by faith and action from birth. To her it is denied by faith and action from birth. His is never big enough. And I think with transgenderism, we're seeing this whole new arena for the male self to occupy. It's never big enough, whereas hers is always too big, even if it's naming her cervix, her menstruation, her experience. Hers is always too big, however small. So I find those words of Dworkin's there extremely illuminating in relation to transgenderism. First and foremost, transgenderism involves a fundamental, a symbolic violation, at least. The fundamental claim of male transgenderists is that a man is a woman if he feels like one. It's an identity claim that holds no regard for the sexed bodies of women, the material realities of femaleness, or the oppression of women under patriarchy. It perceives the category of woman as violable. I kind of think of it as they perceive it as like this sort of like undifferentiated mass onto which a male fantasy of femininity can be projected, and a space into which men have a right of entry. And I think when we think about other patriarchal fictions, such as religion, such as very obviously pornography, that also see that women's bodies and women's spaces are intrinsically viable and to which men have a right of entry, I think we can start to really understand the inherently violent nature of transgenderism and what transgenderism is all about. But before going on to look at some specific examples of transgenderism as male violence against women, I do want to have a little think about what we actually mean by by the term violence. And again, I think it's quite important to have a fairly full and comprehensive understanding of what we mean. And I'm drawing here because I find this category is a very useful way to think about the nature of violence. So I'm drawing here on Johan Galton's work, who actually works in peace and conflict theory. But I find this category is very useful. So very often when we think about violence, we think of sort of direct violence, you know, physical violence, rape, war, direct forms of violence. But I think we need to understand what violence means. So I'm following Galton. I am suggesting that violence can be take any of these forms: an event, an action, a process, a narrative, a threat, which has a deleterious and injurious effect on an individual's or a group's basic needs being met, something that injures our basic needs being met, whether these are needs of survival, so in the most direct and brutal sense it could be murder, survival, well-being, social identity and meaning, that we can have, you know, have a sort of a meaningful identity within a social context. I know this word identity is a bit tricky, but what I'm referring to there is, for example, the way that something like the pornography denies or has a deleterious or injurious effect on the meaning of the term woman. And then finally, freedom, our freedom to live and thrive. And to sort of move and have agency in the world. So I'm taking this sort of broad idea because I think it really helps us to grasp the very sort of multifarious nature of transgenderism as male violence on women. So if we think of these categories then, we can see that these kind of injuries can be dealt unto us in a number of ways. First of all, as I mentioned, direct violence. Obviously someone can hit us. Things like rape, sexual assault, female genital mutilation, murder would come under that direct violence category. But also, and I think the piece that I read out before testifies to what we can call structural violence. So things like an economic system which systematically means that certain groups are going to be impoverished, or a political system that means that certain groups aren't going to have their voices heard. Or will be excluded from decision making, etc. So we've got direct, structural and cultural violence. If we think of cultural violence, we're really talking about the whole kind of scaffolding, all the narratives, all the images, all the different stories that culture tells itself in order to legitimise and normalise direct and structural violence. So things like pornography, religion, the kind of variants of patriarchal literature, patriarchal science, etc. So I think these are the kinds of direct structural cultural violence that we need to be thinking about when we think about what the effects that the phenomenon of transgenderism has on women. So I'm going to look briefly through each of these with some suggestions really that you might want to think about. So in terms of direct violence, I really want to give credit to the really amazing feminists who have been documenting the examples of direct violence perpetrated either by men who claim to be trans, male cross-dressers, men who do not necessarily identify as trans but who might adopt a female identity in order to get into women's spaces. So there are a number of blogs here, and you can probably think of some more, but I think Alison's Law in particular, the politics of gender, they say this never happens. There's a whole range of blogs that have done a really stupendous job in documenting some of these. We're just going to have a little look at a few of them. I wanted to draw attention, you can look this up on YouTube, there's a very powerful video called Women Decide for Yourselves, which documents 23 cases. And as I say, this film documents just a small selection of violent and predatory men, all of whom would be allowed in women's most vulnerable spaces under the laws that are currently being passed in the United States that are allowing men to access women's bathrooms and women's facilities, and there's the YouTube reference, so it's quite easy to find. Much more extensive list, the politics of gender, documents 194 cases of serious violent offenders. This one I think is quite interesting because they, that list only includes cases where trans or gender identity was claimed or diagnosed. It doesn't include some of the males that don't claim trans identity, the cross-dressers, and other males under the transgender umbrella are not included, and there are 194 cases listed there. So let's have a look. Again, this is a very cursory glimpse, really, at some of the individuals that we're talking about. So, in the top middle there, we have Paul Wayne Luckman, who now prefers to be known as Nicole Louise Pierce. That's his transitioned self, and the adjacent photo there. He, along with his co-perpetrator in 1982, abducted, beat, raped, and really quite horrifically tortured two young boys. They murdered one of them managed to escape, but the other one they murdered, in fact, they buried him alive. So that's Paul Wayne Luckman, otherwise known as Nicole Louise Pierce. In 1986, this man here, Matthew Richardson, murdered a prostituted woman, and he now prefers to be known as Maxine Richardson. You see that on the left-hand corner there. Coming up to 1990, in the middle there, this man might be known as probably one of the better known of these criminals. Robert Koselleck garroted his wife, who had found him cross-dressing. He garroted her with a rope and with a piano wire to such an extent that he almost decapitated her, and he is now seeking gender reassignment within a US jail. So Robert Koselleck now wishes to be known as Michelle. In 1993, bottom right-hand corner there, Paul Denyer is a serial killer of 3 women. He now wishes to be called Paula. Coming up a bit more up to date now, 2012, Christopher Hambrook, in the right middle there. Christopher Hambrook gained entry into 2 women's shelters under the law that they have in, I think it's Ontario, called Tober's Law, where they had a self-declaration system that a man could access women's spaces through identifying as a woman. He called himself Jessica Hambrook. He accessed 2 women's shelters and he sexually assaulted 2 women. But he'd had a long career of sexual violence prior to that as well. In 2014, Christopher, or he prefers to be known as Pritzy King, up there in the top right-hand corner there, was convicted of the torture and murder of a 4-year-old child. In 2014, also Dana McCallum, this man in the middle here, on the left, who again was one of the more well-known cases because he was a Twitter engineer. He was a prominent women's rights activist, supposedly, and LGBT activist, and he pleaded guilty to raping his wife. And then a case that came to the light last year, but I think the conviction was for some years before, David, or first known as Davina Antonet in the fur coat, raped a 15-year-old girl. So it's a rather cursory look, as I say, through what has become a very well-documented list of violent male perpetrators who either offend as so-called trans women, or they offend prior to then claiming this identity of women, or some of them seem to opportunistically claim to be women for the purposes of accessing women's spaces. So this individual as well is one that I'm not really going to have time to talk about in detail, but again I think it's definitely worth being aware of. Dennis Walbert was better known as Alison Walbert. The blog Alison's Law takes its name from this individual. This so-called Alison was a prominent transgender activist who has set up the Transgender Human Rights Institute in the States. He was recognised by PFLAG, which is the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. He gained recognition from them as a community activist. And then it came to light in 2015, his whole history of the serial rape of his 14-year-old stepdaughter came to light, and then he had to resign his post. So it's worth being aware that some of these murderers, rapists, and criminals gain rather prominent positions within the trans and LGBT community. Coming up to a very, very current issue about access to women's spaces, where we're constantly being told that there are no examples of so-called trans women committing violence against women in toilets, in changing facilities, etc. This blog here, Trans Widow, documents 22 cases, the majority of which happened within women's bathrooms or women's changing facilities, but they include a whole range of violence perpetrated by men on women and children, particularly children, including physical violence, sexual violence, child sexual abuse, and what we're really seeing a lot of will come on to the secret filming or taking photographs of women and girls within women's toilets or within women's changing rooms. So probably a lot of you are aware of this. I don't think I've even heard of this store, Target, before, but over here. So it's kind of like Walmart. Who's both the Americans? It's big. Yeah, it's big. Is it kind of like Walmart? Yeah. Is it similar? So it's a big kind of supermarket, big one of these big American stores. Anyway, there's been a campaign to trying to get them to change their policy, but on the 19th of April this year, in response to some of the states in America which have been trying to get protections for women by stating that women's facilities should be used by those who actually have the sex bodies of being female and vice versa. But Target opened up their, obviously it's a kind of store where people are trying on different clothes, getting changed, etc. So they opened up their toilets and their changing facilities to anyone who, according to your sort of self-identification, according to your sexual gender identity. And since that time, there have been numerous reports, these are some that I found, numerous reports of voyeurism, secret filming, and sexual harassment of women and young women and girls within those facilities. So, sorry?
I said one, not
one. Okay, well I'm going to take 5. You didn't show me that. Okay, I'll speed it up a bit. Okay then. So, but I do think that I wanted to show those to because I know some of you will be aware of them, but a lot of you may not be. But I wanted to come on to think about the structural nature of transgenderist violence against women. But I don't really need to dwell on this because I think a lot of the talks have already captured it and a lot of the ones later on will capture it as well. But we need to think about, if we think about structural violence, processes, systems, actions, policies, etc., that have a deleterious or injurious effect on women's freedom, on women's well-being. Look at these. Transgenderism, this is what the consequences of transgenderism are, this is what transgenderism is achieving. The loss of women-only spaces and services, the loss of our ability to set boundaries. It almost sounds a bit of an anodyne. Think about what that means, think about the implications of what that means for women, the loss of ability. In the rape culture, in the patriarchal culture we live in, the loss of ability to set boundaries. I haven't even touched on this because I knew that Stephanie would be covering this to some extent. We haven't even begun the discussion about the physical and psychological harms of the women and girls, particularly the young women, who so-called transition. And we saw some of those images from Stephanie before that I think are starting to make that point. The erasure of women from the public sphere as men take up places, representing women in science, heading up women's studies departments, heading up gender studies, within sports, at the Olympics, getting applauded as Woman of the Year, getting accolades. So there we are, male basketball player who reckons that he's a woman. Look at him. I can't remember his name. So I just thought, because I was finalising this talk when the World Cup was on, the final, and I thought, there's old-fashioned, sexist. I never thought I would say it. At least you know where you stand. Talking about a load of other men running around after a ball, trying to get it in the goal, getting paid millions for it. At least you know where you stand with that image compared to this one. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. This was at a transgender equality seminar I was at a couple of weeks ago. Now, at first glimpse, to the untutored eye, we might be mistaken for thinking that this is a majority female. Well, we wouldn't actually. But what they're trying to get is the thing. So we've got here a so-called trans women representing trans women in sports. We've got a so-called trans woman head of science at a school. The woman in the middle actually is a woman. Testified that. And then we've got Anna Lee representing women students, apparently from the NUS, and then we've actually got an old-fashioned man in trousers as well. So there we go, there's the difference. So this is the structural violence we're talking about. Sorry, I know I need to finish up. So, not only are we being physically erased from any kind of inroads that we've made into the public sphere, the erasure of knowledge about male violence against women, male perpetrators being counted as women. So it absolutely has a decimating effect on what we know about the prevalence of male violence against women if we're going to start pretending that these are women committing all these acts of rape and murder against other women. The erasure of feminist knowledge, because we can't even say he when we mean he, well we can, but we are punished for saying he when we mean he. So the erasure of feminist knowledge, language and analysis, and obviously, as Leah was talking about, the catastrophic effect that it potentially has on women's organising for liberation. Although the fact that we're all here today means it hasn't had that effect on us, but that is what it's designed to do. It's designed to have a catastrophic effect. So I'm just going to finish off really quickly. I can't go through these examples. How has all this been achieved? It's been achieved through cultural violence, through a whole set of stories, of narratives, of tales that the patriarchal culture loves to tell itself about what men are really like. So, or what men are really like when they say that they're women or whatever it is. So legitimising narratives, all the kind of media narratives that Stephanie was talking about, which I can't go into, the extraordinarily biased news coverage, the legislative development, so we get all these screens now telling us who can go where, who can say what. You could be fined, I don't know, $250,000 in New York if you say he instead of she, or so. And then let's not forget the culture of violence and fear that has been generated absolutely from the trans community, from the trans activists. So all of these things, havoc, TERFs, veterinary TERF, kill all TERFs, this kind of thing. Let's not make any mistake about the culture of violence that they have created. Just to return to Andrea Dworkin's words, the absolute self is expressed in the absolute right to take what it needs to sustain itself. How have they achieved this so easily and so quickly? Again, talking in a woman-hating culture, it is particularly difficult to make credible the claim that a crime committed against a woman must matter. And this image comes from the Women Speak Out event in Washington State, where the trans activists tried to shout down an extremely brave survivor of child sexual abuse. And she was saying that crimes committed against women matter. And I think we all, if we stand for anything, we all absolutely stand by that and support it and do what we can to make that meaningful. Thank you very much.